and I'm excited to introduce our second panel, which is focused on psychedelics legislation and regulation. We have an equally impressive lineup for you. Bye, everyone. Thanks so much. And that includes California Senator Scott Wiener, Sharan Sidhu from Numinous, Graham Boyd, and Dr. David Shurtleff. I think I'll now, we'll get started by giving each of our panelists 1 or 2 minutes to introduce themselves and mention anything that they think is particularly important given today's conversation. I think we'll start with Sharon and then move to Senator Wiener. Sharon, welcome.
Hi, thank you, Mark, and thank you thank you, Mason, and thanks for the organizers for putting this together. So far, it's been a great conversation. This is the first time I've actually been to something that Rick has spoken to, so fantastic hearing from him. So my name again, Sharan Sidhu. I'm the Science Officer and General Manager here at Numinous Bioscience, which is actually a subsidiary of Numinous Health Wellness, and it is a publicly traded company that is has a number of clinics and is working towards offering psychedelic-assisted psychotherapy. We have clinics already offering ketamine-assisted psychotherapy, and we have many therapists in our network who are working towards a change in regulations, constant conversations with Health Canada, briefing notes to them about special access. So we're kind of in the pit of things here. We are based in Canada. I myself am based at the lab on the island, Vancouver Island. So we work with the Canadian regulations. We have a lot of communications, obviously, with the FDA. What I do is oversee policy and regulations as it pertains to the controlled drugs and substances, which is what psychedelics fall under here in Canada. And I pretty much look after all the licensing, regulations, communications with Health Canada. I have been in regulations and policy for the last 15 years, as well as worked kind of in the hub of industry, academia, and governance to commercialize products whilst following the regulations. And this is very interesting for me because I've always been in that high growth, high risk industry. And so psychedelics was definitely attractive for what I've been doing in the past. Every industry I've been in has always had always been in a regulatory flux, this one being one of them. And you know, the attraction to moving into psychedelics is, you know, we're talking about making a major change to the health of many people that need it and to the populace as a whole. So again, very glad to be here.
Thank you, Sharon. Senator Wiener, welcome.
Thank you. Thank you for having me. Good to see everyone. So I'm Scott Wiener. I serve in the California State Senate representing San Francisco and the northern part of San Mateo County. I do a lot of work around drug policy and drug sentencing reform, as well as around expanding access to mental health and addiction treatment. And psychedelics sort of sits at the crossroads of those various policy goals, and so it was really a no-brainer for me. We are working very hard to try to end the war on drugs, which we heard from the last panel, of course, is a completely artificial construct that really erases a lot of cultures, but also, of course, is incredibly racist and has fueled mass incarceration of in Black and Brown communities. And so we need to stop trying to arrest and incarcerate our way out of drug use. It doesn't work. Drugs are a health issue, not a criminal justice issue. And with psychedelics, of course, we have all the benefits for mental health and well-being. My first interaction with the issue was a while back, maybe 10 or 15 years ago. A former colleague of mine and his wife, their teenage son, became addicted to heroin. They tried absolutely everything. They had resources and tried anything that money could buy in terms of trying to help him get well and to stop using, and everything failed. And they, out of desperation, eventually sent him down to an ibogaine program in Mexico. He went through that program and has not used heroin since. So we know that these drugs are incredibly powerful in so many ways. That they can be, of course, any substance can be misused, but they can be used in a safe and healthy way, and we need to empower that. And so I'm authoring Senate Bill 519, which would decriminalize the possession and use for personal use and sharing of psychedelics. We made a lot of progress this year, moved it almost all the way through the entire legislature. We realized at the end that we needed more time to build support in the assembly. And so we made it what's called a 2-year bill. So it'll come up again for hopefully those final couple steps next year. Have a great coalition of advocates of many, many stripes, including veterans and parents and Indigenous practitioners, and just an amazing group of people. And so we're going to keep fighting the fight.
Thank you, Senator. We will go to next to Graham and then to Dr. Shurtleff.
Thank you. It's really, it's wonderful to be here, and especially to be on this panel with these other great folks in our movement. Thanks so much for inviting me. A bit of background about me. About 25 years ago, I founded the National ACLU's Drug Law Reform Project, a project dedicated to ending the war on drugs for all the reasons that that our other panelists have already stated. And the one that particularly has motivated me then and now is about the racial disparities and what I see as just the continuing legacy of slavery and Jim Crow that our drug law regime has imposed through incarceration and denial of housing and education and so many other basic fundamental parts of participating in society. So I ran the ACLU project for about 15 years and argued cases in the Supreme Court and courts all around the country, shifting some of the rules around how the drug laws function. I'm proud of that work, but also realized that it was limited, that we really needed to change the laws themselves. And so I've worked for the past 10 years more as a political organizer and activist than as a litigator. And in particular have organized and run most of the state ballot initiatives to change the cannabis laws. So I've been involved in 21 campaigns so far of change the laws, both for recreational or adult use marijuana and medical marijuana in a number of states through using that tool, the ballot initiative. And only recently did I start to really look at psychedelics as an area where both we could be undoing the war on drugs, but also proactively building up a healing modality and an infrastructure for bringing healing to people. In other words, tearing down the bad, but also building up the good. And I have been happy to be able to work with Senator Wiener and his staff and others to support the California effort. And I've also played a fairly central role in Oregon in passing the Oregon Psilocybin Program Initiative, which was on the ballot in November of last year. And the Oregon voters enacted that. And I think that's probably the main thing that I would be talking about on this panel, is how this state law creates permission under Oregon law, not federal law, just under Oregon law, for people to have access to psilocybin in a therapeutic context. Importantly, that's not just a medical context. So I would contrast this to the FDA approval route that it will lead to prescription use for some psychedelics. This is actually for people who don't necessarily have a medical diagnosis, but who would benefit from supervised therapeutic access to psilocybin. So that's the system that is coming into existence in Oregon and will be launched and ready to begin in January of 2023. So thanks so much.
Thank you, Graham. Dr. Shurtleff, welcome.
Thank you, Mason. It's a pleasure to be here, part of this panel. So I'm representing NCCIH, the National Center for Complementary and Integrative Health. I'm Deputy Director and Acting Scientific Director at NCCIH. And for those of you who may not know, NCCIH is part of the National Institutes of Health. And we're, the world's leading research organization with our overall mission to seek fundamental knowledge about nature, behavior, and living systems, and to apply that knowledge to enhance health, lengthen life, reduce illness and disability. And we're kind of a unique organization within the NIH in that we're not particularly focused on any one disease or condition. Our primary interest is to study complementary approaches that can promote health and manage a variety of conditions. We're primarily focused on pain, and I can talk more about that later, but also stress, anxiety, depression. And when I refer to complementary approaches, I'm really referring to dietary interventions, that's a study of natural products, including cannabinoids, and for the purpose of this discussion, psilocybin, dietary supplements, herbs, probiotics, microbial therapies as well. And in addition, we're interested in mind and body interventions and the study of yoga, tai chi, dance therapies, some forms of art therapy, meditation, hypnosis, relaxation therapies, acupuncture, massage, and spinal manipulation. Again, in the context of promoting health and treating disease and other conditions. So with that, I'll stop and look forward to the discussion.
Thank you so much. So I have a series of questions for you, and anyone is welcome to chime in. I may direct some questions to each of you at some point. But I just want to start off with a discussion of prohibition that dates back to the 1970s, which effectively shut down all scientific research for a matter of decades. And I want to ask you, what kind of effect do you think that had on the science, and what can we learn from that period moving forward to make sure that perhaps we don't make certain mistakes again?
I can go first. So, so just from context, as we're a research organization, and we do benchtop research here as well as clinical research. And from my perspective, it is a matter of if I look at things how they would normally happen, science comes first, recognizes a need, and fills a gap. Right? This is happening the other way around. So the gap has been recognized, it's already being filled, and the science has come later. So it's here in Canada, the regulatory hoops and hurdles that you have to go through to be able to do research on psychedelic compounds and narcotics it's quite extensive, like it is in the US. And we are lucky that we have a license so we can do that research. But then all of the academic institutes that want to do that research have to be able to acquire materials from a regulated facility. Again, we're now seeing academia filling those gaps and starting that research. But I do feel that the product development is already way ahead of the primary research that normally gets initiated, where a gap or a need or even just a query is seen by researchers. So I definitely think it's held that back a little bit. I think if we had more research, more primary research done, where there was more, inquiries that were reviewed by academia, that we would probably be further ahead.
Thank you. Anyone else like to comment on what we can learn from prohibition moving forward with future psychedelics legislation?
Well, Mason, I'll just say briefly that I think an important part of your question is why did the backlash happen in the first place? And what are we doing now to insulate against that backlash or potentially to promote it? And I do think it's important to be mindful. Well, let me say this. It's not just that I think this. So I've done a good deal of public opinion research with focus groups around the country and polling. And one of the things I can say is that those of us who are very interested in psychedelics live in something of a bubble where we're talking to one another. And it's important to be mindful that the rest of the world, the rest of the country, voters in particular, don't necessarily share all of our assumptions and ways of thinking about this. And so as we advance forward, I think trying to stay tethered to information that can be validated by evidence is important. Going purely on anecdote can kind of get us out over our skis a little bit. Even though anecdote is certainly how we can learn, but in terms of that public narrative, and in particular, not falling into the mode of talking about any of these substances as being panaceas, as cure-alls, to sort of stay in that balanced place of saying that based on research, there's tremendous promise, that we are in a mental health crisis, that where there is promise, it deserves to be explored. But I think to the general public, if we start saying this is the answer to everything, and if only everybody could take psychedelics, then the world would be filled with peace and harmony, is I think setting us up for a kind of backlash. Related to that, there'll be some people who end up experiencing harm, and psychedelics will be part of the story. And we can't pretend that won't happen. And I think that's why data collection is incredibly important. In the Oregon context, if there ends up being 1 or 2 or 3 incidences of something going wrong, if we have a data set that shows that there are 10,000 incidents of nothing going wrong, or indeed some things going really well, that puts it in context. So the bad anecdote can actually be quite harmful too. So all of that is really part of my answer of saying, like, let's not have another backlash where we experience another generation of no scientific research and just arrest and incarceration instead.
I think that it's really important when we're having these conversations with people, and I found this when I talked to my colleagues or others, when people express concerns that, oh, if you take LSD, you're going to have flashbacks, or you're going to, this harm or that harm. And of course, we remind them that, you can have harm from any substance, including substances you buy over the counter in a drugstore. And so this is not unique to any one substance. But I try to always bring it back to people that, okay, you can have whatever opinion you want about whether people should use psychedelics and what circumstances, et cetera. But the question for you is, should we be arresting and incarcerating people for possessing and using these drugs? You can love them or hate them. But is that the right approach to be arresting and incarcerating people for this? And the answer is almost always no, we shouldn't be doing that. And then I say, well, that's in terms of what we're doing here, that's sort of the end of the inquiry, because we're trying to decriminalize and move away from a war on drugs approach. And I think it's really important to bring it back to that. When people say, I'm worried that my kid is going to use psychedelics, I always say, well, your kid can use psychedelics right now. And people of all ages are using psychedelics right now, whether or not it's legal or whether or not it's legal. And the question is, do you want your kid to be arrested for using the psychedelics or not arrested? And then it's like, well, of course I don't want my kid to be arrested. So I try to bring it back to that very foundational question.
Yeah, I think to just pick up on that point of what Graham said, I think the research is critically important. Rigorous, objective research is really that's unbiased. I think that's really going to get us out of this conundrum of thinking about this drug in certain ways. And I think about looking back on the 60s and 70s, look at my own field of neuroscience. The Society for Neuroscience only started in 1969. So it was sort of at the tail end of the war on drugs. And I think what the brain science is showing us is how these drugs work in the brain, the mechanisms, how they affect behavior, how they affect mood, how they affect brain mechanisms. I think that gives us a grounding for better able to discuss what these drugs do and how they work. And it takes away maybe some of the stigma associated with these compounds. The brain doesn't know from legal or illegal. It just, there's mechanisms in the brain that we need to understand and study and be able to convey that in an objective manner.
Yeah, I think I would agree with David. Any argument or any case that we make with governing bodies has to be backed up with robust scientific data. subjective data and anecdotal data won't work.
That's true for regulatory bodies, but in terms of decriminalization, I really want to make sure we're separating that out. Yes, of course, we're going to make the case that these drugs can have significant benefits, but I also never want to fall into the trap in the decriminalization process that you have to show a benefit in order to not arrest and incarcerate someone. Because I also think, for other drugs that, methamphetamine, I think the world would be a better place if meth just evaporated and didn't exist. But it does, and we shouldn't be arresting and incarcerating people for it, even though it doesn't have very many benefits, and it's a deeply harmful substance.
I want to pick up on something you just mentioned, Senator Wiener, about having to show a medical benefit in order to not arrest people and put them in prison. And that seems to be the system that we have now, because with the scheduling process, you need to show medical evidence, probably from phase 2 trials at least, in order to change the law so that people are not incarcerated. So I think that psychedelics are really drawing attention to that that situation that was created in the 70s. And there increasingly seems to be bipartisan support for focusing on research to make these medical therapies, as well as potentially for decriminalization. How might we capitalize on that to prevent this backlash, this potential backlash that Graham mentioned?
I mean, I think it's hard because in conversations with colleagues, policymakers, sometimes they say, well, this should just all be done through the FDA, or this should be done all through the medical pharmaceutical process. And I which is, not, I think, the right way to do it in terms of course, decriminalization. And I think also that there are some drug policy advocates who are not skeptical, but are not enthusiastic cheerleaders of decriminalizing psychedelics. I mean, they support decriminalizing psychedelics, but they worry that you start cherry picking. Oh, these are the good drugs, so we're going to decriminalize those. But we're not going to decriminalize the bad drugs. And so I try to always, in my messaging around this bill and this issue, talk about how this is a step, and we need to be broadly decriminalizing drug use and possession. And this is not about, good drugs versus bad drugs.
I just want to, I want to agree with that and really say, Mason, to the sort of premise of your question that there needs to be some medical evidence before decriminalization can proceed. Absolutely not. I think decriminalization, there's a fundamental question of when someone is using a substance for whatever reason, recreationally, for fun, for distraction, for treatment of something, when someone's using that substance, is any good accomplished by arresting that person? And I mean, there's just not. I think the idea that we would arrest people comes more from moral panic than it does from any notion of good public policy. I think it gets more nuanced and complicated when you talk about people who are involved in or who want to be involved in producing or selling different drugs. And my view is there's not a one size fits all solution. I think that depending on the nature of the substance, and here's where science really does come in, there are different solutions that may or may not be better. And I think we should go a step at a time and kind of see what works. And by works, I mean what is going to maximize the good and minimize the harm from the policy solution that's chosen. We've got now a bit of a track record around one model that for cannabis of essentially a commercial product that's available to adults who want to use it. You can just go and buy and do what you want to with it. I tend to think that's not the right model for methamphetamine or fentanyl. And I'm not even sure it's the right model for psychedelics. But the point is, let's try to bring wise people together and come up with what good models might be. And that's what Oregon represents. That's one model where there is access for adults to psilocybin, not just for medical purposes, but with a different kind of oversight and regulation than exists for cannabis. And I think we'll learn a lot from that. We should gather the data, see what works and what doesn't, and eventually get to the point where in the near term, as Senator Wiener says, people just shouldn't be arrested for their individual or even group use of something. But then when we think about the larger supply issues and production issues, let's be smart about it and come up with something that's actually good for society and good for people, and that ultimately doesn't involve incarceration as a tool.
I want to bring in some audience questions. We have a question from Danny Winton. How can patients be protected from unqualified or unethical psychiatrists, therapists, and providers? So what is the role of regulation there? And then on the other side of things, we had another question about in reference to the REMS that Rick Doblin mentioned that the FDA is requiring. These are extra requirements for administration of MDMA that will be required, extra training and safeguards. So is it possible to go a little bit too far on the other side of things by requiring too much regulation to protect people?
Well, I think one of the things we do in SB 519 is we also create a working group to make further recommendations to the legislature beyond straight up decriminalization. And one of the areas that I think is really important to explore is the possibility of having some sort of certification for therapists, for example, who can help people with psychedelic therapy. I don't pretend to be an expert in the area, but I think that, and I know that there are sort of right now underground programs where people go and get that training, but it'd be great for consumers to be able to say, okay, this person has, whether it doesn't have to even be a government some sort of marker where they know this is someone who knows what they're doing.
Yeah, we've got obviously there are training programs that are available through MAPS for MDMA, but Numinous is developing training for therapists for CAP as well as psilocybin-assisted psychotherapy. And it's vetted through our most experienced therapists, so Devon Christie and Evan Woods. And, it's a very rigorous process that they're going through to develop these protocols. We have therapists that are very well versed in delivering therapy, psychedelic-assisted psychotherapy. Joe Flanders, who runs our Montreal clinic, he's very experienced in ketamine-assisted therapy, so is Devon. So we're drawing from some real-world expertise in delivering these therapists. As well as the therapists that are selected to be trained have to have a baseline requirements to be able to go through the training program as well. Is it standardized? Not yet, especially not here in Canada. Are we looking at standardizing these therapies and getting certificates for them? I mean, yes, the discussions happened, but it's a very long, rigorous process.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point. This is, when you think about the use of psilocybin or MDMA or some of these compounds, it's medication-assisted therapy. So a big component of this is the therapeutic behavioral intervention. And that's needs to be studied in and of itself. How do these two elements, the pharmacology of the drug and the intervention, the psychotherapy, the behavioral intervention, work together? And how is that protocolized, and how are people trained and licensed to do this work? So it all goes hand in hand with doing the research on both the pharmacotherapy and the behavioral intervention. And if you look at the study that NIDA just funded with Matt Johnson, it's for smoking cessation, but it's using a CBT model as well as psilocybin. So it's that combination that's critical. And as was pointed out, how you protocolize, as Sharon pointed out, that intervention. So it's standardized across treatments, I think, is another step in implementation of these therapies, which is another whole area of research, by the way, is implementation research.
Yeah, it is. There's still a lot of work to do.
I'm curious to know what you think right now are some of the largest legal obstacles to advancing the science as well as advancing decriminalization, either here in the US, in Canada, or even internationally.
For me, it's...
Oh, anyone who'd like to take
Yeah,
it, certainly.
It's, for me, it's actually cost, right? Research is expensive, right? And I think you'll see that across the board, where, you know, obviously clinical research is expensive, benchtop research is expensive, and it's we want to do so much research in so many different substances. It's pretty much picking where you put your resources and what would have the most value. And then also we're developing products for therapy, but we're also cognizant of the cost of that product as well. So we're trying to find efficiencies in that cost of per unit while still maintaining quality and while still maintaining safety and efficacy, to be able to offer that at a reasonable cost, right? So definitely for me, it's the cost, which is the obstacles. Again, as far as regulations go, we're working with the regulators right now to make sure that we're on the right path. But the risk is that those regulations might change and we'll have to pivot.
So Mason, to your question of what's the largest legal impediment, it depends on the change you're talking about. There really isn't a legal impediment to ending the arrest of people who use psychedelics. It's a political one. Each state fully has the power to change its law, and municipalities have the power to instruct their police to deprioritize arresting people for using psychedelics. That politically, that there are some very serious obstacles to that happening, but legally there's not. And the fact that it remains illegal under federal law doesn't really matter within that arena, because the federal police force, the DEA, doesn't bother itself with arresting people for personal possession of psychedelics. However, if you're looking at how do you create a broader system of meaningful, safe access to psychedelics, then the largest impediment is federal law. If you want to do that consistently with federal law, the only avenue is either to change federal law, which I think is politically not going to happen in the near future, or to get approval from the FDA, the sort of route that Rick Doblin was discussing. But that's only a narrow form of access. That's for people who have a medical diagnosis and who are having access through a physician. So broader access requires doing something like we're doing in Oregon, where you change state law, you go ahead and do it despite the fact that federal law doesn't allow it, and then hope for some kind of political accommodation. But the real obstacle there is federal law itself.
With Oregon's new laws and potentially California having new laws as well very soon, and others potentially following suit, what would be the best case scenario for potential collaboration with the federal government and federal agencies? What might that actually look like in an ideal situation?
I think for California law, Senator Wiener, you should probably speak to this for yourself, but I don't think the federal government really matters if you're talking about just California stopping arresting people. They can just do that. I think the later stage of once the study commission happens and we come up with a broader avenue of therapeutic use in California, that ends up raising the same questions that Oregon raises right now, which is, will the federal government step in? And they do have the power to do so, and enjoin or through law enforcement cause to stop the people who want to open up and start providing psilocybin therapy. That could happen. I think the reason it wouldn't happen is because the U.S. attorney, the chief prosecutor in Oregon, or the Department of Justice itself, looks at the situation and says, this is actually an improvement in terms of federal interests. And here I'll draw the parallel to cannabis. In the early days of cannabis legalization, the federal government very actively tried to stop both first medical and then eventually adult use activities, dispensaries, that sort of thing. And even in the earliest days, tried to stop doctors from recommending medical marijuana. I litigated a case in 1998 called Conant versus Walters that established a First Amendment right for doctors to be able to recommend marijuana. What eventually shifted is I think that policy makers in the Department of Justice realized that a regulated system of access to cannabis was better than letting the cartels decide for themselves how they wanted to distribute cannabis. So that's a little bit of a messy answer to the question, but I will say this, that the federal interest around psilocybin in Oregon is not about protecting the health and safety of patients. That's what the FDA does. But what the DEA does is to try to disrupt drug trafficking. And the system of Oregon regulated access for psilocybin through state licensed clinics is actually consistent with the federal interest. And so I think it's very likely that the Department of Justice will not interfere with that system.
Senator Wiener, I wonder if you could tell us a little bit more just about the genesis of SB 519, some of the changes it's gone through and what you hope for its future.
Well, the genesis is, as I mentioned at the beginning, I do a fair amount of drug policy work in various respects. Sorry, the light just went off in my office. And so we were watching what was happening in Oregon and elsewhere, and decided let's explore this in California. In terms of the bill, I think the significant changes that happened to the bill is we were sort of forced to remove ketamine. Ketamine was always the go-to drug for the opposition, referring to it as a quote unquote date rape drug, even though we disagreed with that characterization and constantly remind them that the ultimate date rape drug is alcohol, and you're not banning that. But that became a narrative, and we realized that having ketamine in the bill, unfortunately, threatened to drag the whole bill down. The bill would have died, would not made it as far as it did. And given that ketamine is the psychedelic that is currently actually prescribable, we decided that reluctantly that we would remove it from the bill. We also, in the Assembly Health Committee, the committee and the chair wanted us to put volume limits or quantity limits in terms of what would be decriminalized. The bill always effectively had quantity limits because we were not decriminalizing possession with intent to sell, which can really only be determined by the volume of drugs that you possess. But it was more subjective. What a police officer or a court decides is enough to infer intent to sell. So we worked with our coalition, and we posed, we didn't, it wasn't our preference to put volume limits in, but given that the committee insisted on it, we suggested what those would be if they were going to insist on it, and they accepted that. And so we put that into the bill. Those were the two, I think, significant changes, and neither one was surprising. I will also just say one point of contention that's been from the beginning is how to treat peyote. And it was not a fight that I was looking to be involved with or in the center of, but unfortunately it was just, it became an issue. There were just a dispute among advocates about whether peyote should be decriminalized or not. There were people, including the Native American Church, who believed that it should not be included in the bill because it would lead to peyote tourism. And there are already federal protections for practitioners, for indigenous practitioners. There were other advocates who thought it should absolutely be decriminalized. So we ultimately did not include peyote in the bill. Mescaline from other plants is decriminalized, but not peyote. And that's just been a continuing source of disagreement, and we did the best that we could on it.
Thank you for that explanation. I want to turn a little bit more to the role of federal agencies. We've talked a little bit about the FDA and the DEA. And I'm curious to ask you, Dr. Shurtleff, a little bit more about the role of the National Center for Complementary and Integrative Health in this landscape.
Yeah, it's a great question. It's more that, we're a biomedical research organization within the federal government. We're not a regulatory agency. So our goal really is to provide the scientific evidence that informs people on this panel and informs decisions that they make as policymakers. We also provide objective research information that helps inform the public and healthcare professionals. So that's really goes along with our mission to improve the public health. It also it's part of our mission is to inform key decision makers and helping them use the information we provide in developing their laws and policies that are put in place. So we're, I guess, one step removed from the policy making, but I hope I hope the information we do provide is useful and used in that regard. And just in general, as NCCIH, we are a little different from most of the other institutes at the NIH. We are more on the behavioral health approach. We're interested in promoting health, whole person health, a holistic approach to health. And we are very much interested in natural products. And I think if you look at cannabis or cannabinoids, we have a robust research program on cannabinoids, particularly for the management of pain. We do a lot of epidemiological work, and we look to see how people are using these compounds. And if you look at cannabis, the major reason people report use of cannabis is for management of pain. And then the question is, can we build on that observational research to further study what are the analgesic properties of cannabinoids? How can we better, and we do take a more of a drug development approach. How can we then take what we know, what the public is saying, and develop and optimize medications for the management of pain? And that, I think pain is particularly in the forefront of everything right now for us because of the opioid crisis, the pain crisis in the United States, overdose deaths occurring with opioids. We need other approaches to manage pain, and certainly cannabinoids provide one approach along with our mind-body interventions. The main reason people seek out complementary approaches such as chiropractic or Tai Chi or acupuncture is for the management of pain. But we still need to learn more about how they work and how we can optimize those therapies as well. And then in terms of psilocybin specifically, we've had an inquiry from a number of investigators who are interested in exploring psilocybin and its role for management of chronic pain, managing pain catastrophizing, which is a major component of pain management. So we touch every aspect of this discussion in terms of providing the evidence and the research needed to move policy forward, but we're not policy makers, if that makes sense.
Thank you. We have a question from Nabil Al-Khaled on rescheduling, and they're commenting on Rick Doblin's presentation regarding how MDMA would be rescheduled once it becomes FDA approved. In that case, there would be a currently accepted medical use that would require it to be removed from Schedule 1. Is psilocybin likely to follow a similar path, or is there any universe in which it could potentially be rescheduled before FDA approval?
I'm not from the FDA, but I can just comment on, for example, Epidiolex or CBD. Once that became FDA approved for the treatment of epilepsy, rare forms of childhood epilepsy, it was rescheduled as a Schedule 7 compound. So I think that is the key to getting these compounds rescheduled, is to show medical use or benefit. And then that it follows from there that the drug will need to be rescheduled based on discussions with FDA and the DEA.
Mason, I'll take your question. I don't think there's any realistic prospect that psilocybin gets rescheduled prior to FDA action. And also, just to clarify for folks, the rescheduling that is likely to happen for MDMA, and I hope eventually for psilocybin, will probably look a lot like what happened with GHB, which is to say that that when that molecule is manufactured by the pharmaceutical company and supplied to doctors and from doctors to patients, then that version of the drug, so this is true for GHB today, that version of GHB is legal. But if you make GHB yourself, or some chemist makes it and you get it from them, that GHB, even though it's chemically identical, is actually still Schedule 1 and illegal. And that's probably what the world will look like around MDMA in the near future too, that the MDMA that's manufactured by MAPS, supplied through its supply chain eventually to physicians who prescribe it, to patients who consume it in a therapy room under the supervision of a therapist, will be 100% legal. But the MDMA that you might get from somewhere else would still be just as criminal.
You bring up a really good point. I like to point out that THC right now exists in 3 different schedules, in Schedule 2 and 3, because there are 2 FDA-approved medications that contain it. And then, of course, in Schedule 1, in its natural form in cannabis. And you bring up a good point that once Oregon's system comes online in 2023, even if Compass's psilocybin was to become FDA approved, that would be a different formulation, a different set of requirements than the Oregon system. I think some people might have a misunderstanding that somehow they will be, merged together, but they will in fact be distinct. But this conversation just reminds me of something we touched on earlier that Senator Wiener mentioned, that this seems to be a problem, that in order to make something no longer a felony at the federal level, we need to establish medical efficacy, which seems strange. So is there any way that we could address that just from a broader perspective in terms of the scheduling process under the Controlled Substances Act? What can we learn from this obvious problem to potentially improve the law moving forward?
Well, I mean, Congress could restructure the drug laws and make them rational. And that'd be great. I'm not holding my breath. And their struggles to do things like the debt ceiling. But, that's something that I think that should be a project, long-term project, to rationalize the federal drug laws. Because I agree, it shouldn't just be, okay, if you have one particular formulation of one particular drug that the FDA approves, and then your doctor can prescribe it to you and you won't get arrested for that. But for anything else, you still get arrested.
I mean, the other route that I'm a little bit more hopeful of, not tomorrow, but sometime, is that rescheduling can happen either by congressional action or by executive action. So technically, the head of the DEA can initiate rescheduling. And, the president that we have now and his views on drugs, I'm not holding my breath on that either. But I guess I want to paint a slightly rosier picture that, say, 4 years from now, we do have prescription access to MDMA and to psilocybin and potentially to other substances, that not just Oregon and then California, but let's say a dozen states have created well-structured, regulated systems for access where the sky hasn't fallen and people are being helped. I think at that point, you could make the case to the Attorney General and to the head of the DEA that it's time to actually reschedule these substances across the board. That doesn't seem crazy to me. and even the fact that the current head of the DEA, Ann Milgram, who was the Attorney General of New Jersey before she got appointed by President Biden, she had worked before that as the head of philanthropy at a foundation that actually is very involved actively in drug policy reform, the Arnold Foundation. So, I think it's by far the most hopeful DEA administrator that has been named in my lifetime. And so I want to kind of dream into the possibility that we'll live into a world in which there are reasonable people in charge of these agencies who will make good decisions that are different than the ones being made today.
Thank you, Graham. What could we learn from other countries? So, Canada would be an obvious, a good comparison here. But what can we learn from their legislation?
So the biggest difference here is federal. Like our controlled drugs and substances are controlled federally. So it's, the way they're implemented, as we saw with cannabis, can be different provincially, but really it is the federal government that controls what we do with these compounds. From a therapeutic and if it ever happens, a recreational purpose, right? So really, Numinous' lens is therapy, it's treatment. So we're not really involved in, any kind of conversation as far as recreational magic mushrooms, for example. We're not involved in any of that. We're purely focused on therapy. But like I said, we're in the realm of federal regulations. We're in conversations with the federal government, as opposed to, so obviously there's lobbying at a provincial level. But as far as what we do here for research, product development, drug development, it's all at a federal level. I don't know, I've had dealings with the FDA as well. And what I can say is that, the Health Canada is listening, right? They are listening. We do have open conversations. They are looking at what we do with, under a microscope, because we're one of the only ones that are doing it at the level, at this level. And we're constantly going back and forth about how to set things up, how to make things more efficient, how we make our reporting more smooth. So they are listening, and that is very hopeful for us.
The thing I'm excited about from Canada is the access for people who have a terminal diagnosis through the Exemption 56 route. So there's a lawsuit that is pending right now in the Ninth Circuit that is pushing that boundary a little bit under U.S. law. I don't think that lawsuit is by itself going to open the door completely, but I mean, this is very innovative that Canada allows for a medical provider to petition to the federal health ministry to have a patient have access to psilocybin. And we do know from the polling in the United States and just from a number of interactions with policymakers that the palliative care end of life route of access is one that's particularly easy as a first step. So again, kind of dreaming into a future of federal change, that might be the thing that could be changed in the first instance to allow for access for palliative and end of life care.
Yeah. So interestingly, great system to be able to provide under an exemption. However, right now, because of the first few exemptions that were granted, Health Canada is actually inundated right now with exemption requests. So it's actually kind of, I don't want to say made it more difficult, but it has made them look at this. It is both good and bad, right? So yes, it's holding up the system for being able to issue the exemptions. At the same time, because there is such a demand for them, because they've already set a precedence, they are looking at this as there's an actual need, there is a demand, what can be done. There is also a discussion about N of 1 trials, where you actually have, it's almost like a clinical trial application, but it's for one patient, which are, there is rumor that it's an actual quicker process given the queue for exemption reviews. At the same time, we also know that the Office of Clinical Trials is inundated with applications for clinical trials. So we're just in this constant circle. So something clearly needs to be done. because right now there is a lot of interest in psychedelics for research and development. There's a lot of interest from a therapist point of view, and there's also a lot of interest from a patient point of view. And, we have seen a couple of exemptions going in for more than palliative care. So again, there's a demand, and hopefully that will show the government that something needs to be done.
I want to be respectful of everyone's time, but I do want to give you an opportunity to leave us with some parting thoughts. So I'd like to give you a chance to just express what you think is most important in this rapidly evolving landscape.
I'll jump in first. I think change at the state law level is what's most important. One of the hats I wear is running a sort of political advocacy organization called New Approach. And we are actively gearing up to look at supporting state legislative efforts like Senator Wiener's in California and ballot measures like the one in Oregon. And I think over the next 5 years, we're going to change the laws. Broadly, this community will change the laws in probably a dozen states. So I'm very excited about that. And for people out there in the audience who are looking to participate in that as lawyers who want to be involved in drafting or activists who want to be involved in any way, come join us. I think it's going to be a lot of fun and we're going to really make a big difference.
Thank you, Graham.
Yeah, for us, I think the research continues. I think it's we're getting a lot of interest in, especially around psilocybin. The work is continuing at both the basic and the clinical research levels. I think we're going to learn a lot more about this interesting natural product and provide additional evidence that will drive policy and use in the future. So I'm very excited about where the research is going.
From my perspective, I think is to recognize that no one's going to be able to do this alone, and that collaboration and discussion is going to be very important.
Senator Wiener, any parting thoughts?
No, I think it's all been said. I think this is going to have to start bottom up from the cities and the states, and hopefully one day we'll make a breakthrough with the federal government. It's been very slow going with cannabis, but there have been little glimmers of hope, and I suspect that we could see a breakthrough in Congress at some point. But it's a bottoms up kind of situation.
Well, I'm sure I speak for everyone when I thank you all for the important work you're doing in your different facets of this landscape. And I'm very grateful that you were able to join us here today. I want to thank all of our panelists, all of our attendees. Thanks so much for participating in what was a very productive and fascinating conversation. Thanks so much. And I hope you'll follow our future events and other academic projects. Thank you. Have a great day.
Thank you.
Thanks so much.